Russian government has presented to Federal Congress the project of 2025 budget and the next 3 years overall. This is not just one of the main financial documents of Russia. This is the main financial document because Putin and his power is first of all about money. And of course, looking at where and how are they going to spend them, whether they have enough to cover all their needs. No other documents, no other supplementary materials to the federal budget project can tell you all the details. This is Vladimir Milov, and we promised our viewers that the moment the 2025 budget project of that will be presented, we will go over that, and a lot of conclusions can be drawn about Putin's capability, whether he still has money to continue fighting a war in Ukraine, where can that all lead to. A small disclaimer at first, we are not going to tell you details about the structure of the budget, how the money get there, and all the detailed directions and item of expenses in there, but we will comment major trends and new changes based on which one can make a lot of deductions about how long Putin can and is going to continue this fighting in Ukraine, and what conclusions can be drawn about the politics of Russian government in the near future, looking at all these budgetary projections. So let's start in the orderly fashion. Military expenses. The growth has significantly slowed down. The first question that is on the mind of a lot of people is military expenditures of Russia. This is the main article of Russian budget. Military expenses are returning to Soviet times and breaking through a lot of records. For 2025, they have 13.5 trillion rubles budgeted. And you've seen the notes probably that 41% of the budget for next year is going to be dedicated to different enforcement agencies and military expenses. So this is definitely a priority for Putin. For him today, the war is most important. One can say that he is not going to end his aggression against Ukraine, looking at that. But there is one but here. Putin is running out of resources to continue fighting this war the way he wants to. And we need to spend a bit more time on this. You probably have heard during the last couple times when there were some leaks of budgetary projections about 2025. You probably heard some commentators and some publications saying that Putin has again increased his military expenditures, and that implies that he can continue this war in Ukraine endlessly. There were a lot of pessimistic commentary in this regard. In reality, there is one very significant but here. Indeed, Russian expenses for 2025 are planned to grow for their military. However, the rate of growth is slowing down, significantly slowing down compared to the previous years of war with Ukraine, as they call it, special military operation. You can see that on this chart. If in 2025, the growth of military expenditures compared to the previous year, for example, in 2024, it grew by 67% compared to the previous year. In 22 and 23, annual growth was about 35-60%. Next year, on these parameters, they are planning a very limited growth of military expenses, only at 26%. From 10 with a little bit to 13 plus trillion rubles. So less than $3 trillion per year added. This is a big number, right? But still it does not reflect the real demands of Russian military. The real demands in monetary support that they need in order to continue fighting in some sort of efficacy on the front, even with the current efficacy. And we did talk about that in more details about the crisis in Russian army, where I went into details about the crisis there and what's happening. I'm not going to reiterate that. You can find this video and look it up. I was saying there that no other part of Russian economy and Russian budgetary expenses has enough support. None of them is getting enough money. And mostly military expenses can be split into three parts: production of armor, munitions. Second is logistics and payments to the soldiers and officers. And third is social payments. So, according to statements by Chemizov, the head of Russian military-industrial complex, he's saying that the companies are working at the brink. They cannot continue working with such a low profit margins. In supply lines, everything is in crisis. Military have to buy a lot of their own uniforms, communication means, radio interference devices, and different government bureaucrats were coming out earlier this year saying that the soldiers are destitute, they have to spend their own money to buy stuff, and they look more like a ragtag partisan detachment than a proper army. And you can see also that the amount of expenses and the amount of money is paid to those who signed the contract with the military to fight the war in Ukraine. These rates are growing, and they need to continue growing it because they're running out of people willing to sign it. So they need more money to support that too. Looking at all that, increasing military expenses to less than 3 trillion rubles in 2025, or only by 26%, this is literally about nothing. I personally was thinking, and we did talk a lot about here, that the increase of a military budget in 2025 will be much more drastic. So they would add 5, 7, maybe 10 trillion rubles, and will try to double the budget from 10 to 20 trillion rubles. But, however, I was right enough to win with Michael's bet, and very few experts were saying that Russian military budget will be notable in 2025, but it indeed grew on a lower margin. I was thinking that realistically it would be for them to dump a lot more money into this expense, and if they are serious. So they still supported my prognostication, but at the very low threshold. So what do these 26% of indexation mean? 26% growth. Official inflation today in Russia is 8 to 9% per annum. If you deduce that, that means that in real expression, their military expenses next year are only growing by 15-16%. That's it. And paradoxically, this is actually good news. The bad news is that Putin is not going to conclude this war, but the key word here is yet. Because with the current deficit for military expenditures, he cannot continue fighting it effectively for a long time as well. I'll repeat it once again, looking at these screaming problems in Russian military and military production that we talked about in our recent video. I'll put a link under this one. One needs to amp military expenses significantly. Just 26% nominal and 15 to 16% in real growth. This is literally not addressing the major glaring problems. This is taking a bit of money and spreading it very thin across the most problematic areas. And that means that how we did talk in the previous streams, that in the next 2025, Putin will start facing serious problems with lack of funding of this war. So one can say that yes, military expenses have grown, but too little, not enough, to provide for all the demands of Russian troops fighting in Ukraine. And this is becoming more and more obvious. Another curious question here is, why are they being so modest? And maybe they don't have enough money to fund it. Let's look at this thesis. An attempt to hold expenses under control. So, in reality, problem is very serious. If you look at several previous years, then you can see that Russian government has trouble holding their expenses, first of all military, under control. They're always running beyond the set threshold, and they push for the growth of additional budgetary deficits that need to be filled with something from somewhere, and they don't really have money to do that again. You can look at the numbers of this current 2024. We still have about 3 months to the end of this year, but traditionally Ministry of Finance, in supplementary materials for the budget of next year, they provide estimation of the final amount of income and expenses on the current year. Usually it's pretty close to reality because the end of the year is nigh. And you can see on this chart that the budgetary expenses are about 3 trillion higher than what was planned. It was planned about a year ago, about the same time when they were adopting the budget for 2024. And their income changes, they managed to only grow their income by 1.1 trillion more than they planned. So the discrepancy between growing expenses and growing profits is significant. And here one can say, not without an irony, that Russian Ministry of Finance is a pretty poor prognosticator of the federal budget deficit. Here is, for example, a chart for several years. When they adopt a budget in autumn, they usually, in the purple, that's the plan of the budget deficit. 1.5, 2.5 trillion. But at the end of the year, it usually runs way beyond 3.3 trillion rubles. And this year, one of the interesting news that became known when we got the details about this budget is that they have reviewed deficit of the federal budget for this year significantly. Last year, they planned it around 1.6 trillion rubles. De facto, it will be closer to 3.3. So almost twice the deficit of the federal budget will be over the plan twofold. And I think many of you are watching our weekly streams with Michael Naki, where we often discuss these obvious things, that they will not be able to hold themselves within 1.5 trillion deficit. They will have to spend more. They will run out of money again. And at the end of the year, Ministry of Finance basically is acknowledging it. So they suck as prognosticators. They're better fairy tale tellers than prognosticators for the economy. And their plan to hold the deficit at 1.1 trillion rubles for the next year, they can tell these stories to somebody else. If you look at what they have planned among federal expenses for the next year, they're actually looking at serious dwindling of growth for federal budget. This year, they were planning that the budget had grown by 21% compared to the previous year. Next year, they are trying to tell us that they will be able to hold their expenses at control, and the growth of the budget will only be at 5%, and the deficit of the budget will be within 1 trillion rubles. I don't think one needs to be an economist or a budget specialist to understand that this is another fairy tale that they're trying to sell, and I'm not sure whom to, whether to us, the public at large, or to their boss Putin, so he would believe for several more months that everything is great and Russian economy can hold afloat and the budget can be balanced. Here we can say that financial reserves of the government, the money that they use to fund the budgetary deficit, they're also dwindling. We have shown the chart about that the liquid part of the fund of the national wealth, the live money plus gold, that they have on their accounts, the Ministry of Finance and Central Bank, they have halved since the beginning of the invasion to Ukraine. And they're now at 4.8 trillion rubles. And you can agree that this is not really too far from the deficit of the budget this year in 3.3 trillion rubles. And probably by the 1st of January, the fund that supports all additional expenses will become even slimmer. And Central Bank, in one of its recent publications, actually is already foreseeing a scenario when they deplete that fund completely in 2025. Therefore, there'll be nothing to cover this deficit with. So Ministry of Finance is trying to do everything to limit their expenses, and that's why the growth number is so small. And looking at the previous 3 years and the expenses, how they grew, I think it's absolutely unrealistic. Once again, their expenses in orange will be beating their plans in purple, because they usually spend a ton more to try to achieve the goals they have, and they'll have unplanned expenses that they will have to cover for somehow. There is another stream that I recorded recently about the looming crisis of 2025, and the plans of Minister of Finance, they basically support that they have huge problems with money, and without significant slowdown of the budgetary growth, they are not capable to balance their budget next year. And most likely, like in many previous years, they will not be able to balance shit, and the deficit will be exploding, and they will not have enough money to fund all their wants, and first of all, war. They just will not have enough. Unrealistic prognosis of prices for oil in budget 2025. In this segment, there is another important element. What is the prognosticated price for oil that the next budget is drawn from? And they remain on the position that the oil will remain at about $70 per barrel average as it was this year. But we see that there is a very serious headwind in this segment. We see that oil prices were going down, and there are some prognostications that global prices for oil, even without discounts for Urals for Russian oil, so because of the European oil embargo, Russia has to sell oil via some gray schemes or with significant discounts, and even the average price for oil next year is foreseen to be closer to $60 per barrel. A lot of publications, a lot of analytics from Citigroup, for example, one of the biggest investment banks, they're forecasting it to be closer to 60 because the demand for oil in China is slowing down. Perspective of the global economy is unclear. There is a lot of oil on the market already available. OPEC countries are planning to leave their agreements, and Financial Times are already writing that Saudi Arabia is tired of seeing the losses and lower budgetary figures because of the lower volumes they have to produce according to the agreement. So they're planning to increase oil extraction for next year, starting January, significantly. So far, the outlook for oil price is pretty pessimistic, and high oil prices do not have footing to step on. And that budgetary plan to have oil at $70, almost $70 per barrel, is very unrealistic. They will get much less money from their oil sales next year. The income will be compensated, the loss of income will be compensated by growing tax burden on their people. Next segment. Here comes the question, how are they going to compensate for the difference? Because even if there's a small difference, you need to take money somewhere. And you already probably are aware about taxation code differences that add higher pressure onto the entrepreneurs and companies and people in Russia. And we can see that in numbers. So this is the current 2024 breakdown of budgetary growth. You can see that the first two lines are oil and gas income and non-oil and gas income. Oil and gas has grown by 27%, given that the price of oil has grown only 8% compared to the previous year, and GDP is expected to be at 4%. 4% GDP growth, 8% growth of oil prices, and growth from gas and other economy is at 27%. So government is definitely taking more money from economy than it is growing by. So they're taking more money than they get from the sales of oil. That implies a hidden increase of a taxation burden on different entities in Russia, where they're trying to juice everything they can and harden the taxation regime, where government basically takes more money from entrepreneurs and citizens to compensate for the lackluster growth of oil, which is expected to be in negative in this coming year. And you have heard some prognostications already about the slowdown of the economic growth of Russia. This is related also to the hidden and they're trying to conceal the taxation growth. So in order to compensate for the current budget and them exceeding that budget, they'll continue to withdraw more money from the companies. That means the economy will start slowing down even more. At the end, it means that they will gather less taxes. And we're back at square one. Where will they take the difference from? Because there's going to be end of a line somewhere. What expenses are in Putin's priorities? Next segment. So far, it is difficult for us to see how they can make their ends meet in the financial regard. They see that you look at the numbers, you can see that they're concerned about it themselves, and they increased military expenditures modestly, not as they did before. They planned very weak growth of the budget, expenses, very small deficit. As I am expecting, they most likely will break that picture. They will not be able to control. And we can also see what else is budgeted, what other expenses are budgeted for 2025. And you may have heard the number that in the budget for next year, almost 41% of expenses will be expenses for army and other power agencies, enforcement agencies, so national security, national defense, and all kinds of policing. Social policies remain as the unfavored Cinderella with this government, so they're not growing anything there. And instead of reading details into the budget structure, I just made a comparison of what did the expenses grow mostly for during the last 4 years, compared to 2021, the last year before the beginning of this war. And here you can see the first line is military expenses, almost 400%. That's the main champion of this. They have grown up 4 times. So in 21, they had about 3 with a little bit trillion rubles. Now in 25, they'll be over 13 trillions. Another important element is the serious growth of the expenses to serve the current deficit, government deficit. That has grown almost 300%. We can talk about that separately. As for the other articles, they were growing much more modestly. And here I want to say that traditionally, the expenses on medicine and education, they're barely catching up with indexation, with the official tempo of the inflation. And we know that the real inflation is much higher. So 37% growth for education and health. This does not compensate for devaluating of Russian ruble because of the real inflation even. The last line is social policies. By the way, an interesting point here is very often they mix other enforcement agencies with military. You can see the third line is security and police. Their growth is not really indexed. It was indexed by 45% during 4 years, not much higher than education or medicine. That is telling that except for probably FSB, other enforcement agencies which are non-military or paramilitary, they're also somewhat a secondary, maybe a little less liked Cinderella than social expense. And recently, Kolokoltsev, Minister of the Internal Affairs, was making a statement that the government doesn't have money to pay for police officers and their presence in districts. And according to norm, they do not have, they have actually by 152,000 policemen less than they should have. And here I would appeal to Russian policemen to think whether you want to defend that power so much, who wants to spend so much money on this war in Ukraine, but is not giving enough money for Russian police to index their salaries to even match the wild inflation rates that we are seeing. So perhaps it's once again a reason for police to give it a thought whether they want to defend their current power. And of course, the least liked article of expenses is social politics, which was not policies, that was not indexed since 2021. 5% of indexation over 4 years, this is nothing. What is social policies? This is mostly expenses for donations to the pension fund of Russia. So federal budget donates several trillion rubles of money every year to cover the expenses of Russian pension fund. And these monies were not indexed during the next several years. And this is one of the key reasons why Russian pensions are not catching up with the wild growth of prices. Even according to the data of the official Russian stat, since September of 23, they have been in the negative. Even on the official numbers of inflation, the indexation of pensions was in a negative percent. So everybody who is getting any pension from the pension fund, they are becoming poorer year over year. I'm not even talking about the actual inflation here for the fast-moving consumer goods that Росстат is not even touching. But they do have money for propaganda. Next segment. Another story is that almost 20% growth for government propaganda that is planned for 2025. And these expenses need to grow to 137 billion rubles compared to 114 in 2024. And if you pay attention reading through these numbers, you can see that all these propaganda structures that are telling you how fantastic it is to quarrel with the whole world, to fight a war against your neighbor, they're not doing it for free. They're doing it because of very generous income from the Russian budget. And you can see that social policies and pensions and some other important expenses for people Putin does not have money for, but he has fantastically enough money for Russia Today or Vladimir Solovyov to fund their propaganda. He's got enough billions for them. Explosion of expenses growth for servicing the federal deficit. Next segment. And another important article of expenses that is going to be growing sharply in next year. This is also a reflection of systemic crisis that Russian authorities are facing and Russian finance is facing. This is a significant growth to serve government debt. What is the matter here? You can often hear from powers that our federal debt is low today, and this is true, it is relatively low, but the level of profitability that the market wants from federal bonds is actually very high. It's over 16%. So the market does not believe in Russian government capability to continue paying for the borrowed money. And therefore, they're asking for significantly high percent rates. Today, the federal bonds have to be at over 16% per annum in order to be purchased and funded by different entities. This is the record of all times for existence of these papers. And as you can see by the chart, compared to 23 at the left and to end of 24, this is the growth. Ministry of Finance understands that, and they put a significant growth of expenditures for this budgetary line. If 23 they spent only less than 5% of federal budget to cover the federal deficit, and payments related to that. In 25, 26, they're planning almost 8%. And if it continues in this fashion, the margins, the percent they will have to pay on the bonds will continue growing as well. And we don't see the end to this process. Then the government will have to pay even more for every ruble that they borrow in the market. So when you see some economist that is foretelling you that if Putin wants to, he can always borrow money on the market, we have shown you time and time again that yes, he can, but at a very high percent. And he will have to pay for that in order to maintain and service this debt from the federal budget. So all these mechanics we've been talking in our previous video about the growth of crisis in Russian economy, and looking at the projections of the federal budget for next year, one can say that it's exponential growth planned for servicing the federal debt. The debt itself remains relatively small, but it costs them too much to borrow on the market. And the expenses from their budget year over year will continue growing very sharply. So this will limit Putin's ability, seriously, to find more money outside of the system to fund his endeavors in Ukraine. Results: money running out, and you have to dwindle your plans. Let's draw some conclusions. With all the financial capabilities that Putin still maintains to wage this war, so far he has some. So far, in financial regard, his government machine is not crumbling, but this budget that is presented by the government to the federal Congress, it already has serious cracks in it. We see that during the last 3 years of waging full-scale war against Ukraine, the deficit of budget is uncontrollable. However, Silvanov and Minister of Finance are promising. The orange always spikes above 3 trillion rubles. It breaks all the Minister of Finance prognostications and leads to rapid erosion of government resources, financial resources. And the next 2025 can be the point where they can see the full depletion of any reserves. Then they have some capability to borrow money on the market, but it costs a lot, and it leads to even higher growth of service expenses for this debt. Then the government has a ability to continue increasing taxation, but this leads to serious slowdown of economic activities in the country, and so on. So again, we talked in a previous overview about 2025 that 2025 will be difficult for Putin because a lot of these problems and financial economic issues, they seem to come upon him at the same point. And looking at this budget, it definitely reaffirms that we were correct, that these risks exist, and they definitely will not be able to hold their financial system under control if they do not significantly slow the tempo of growth of military expenses. And that's why the growth of military expenditures that are planned for 2025 are the weakest in the last 3 years. They have no capability to continue being cavaliers in their expenses for the war, even though the situation on the front is really demanding it. If he wants to be continuing to conduct this war effectively, he needs to increase them dramatically. They, however, do not have 25 trillion rubles to do that. They only have 13. And a lot of that money will be eaten by inflation. Then Minister of Finance are saying that they will significantly shrink the tempo of growth of federal budget, and I'll risk here to make a prognostication. We've seen few years, almost 3 years already, that Putin is fighting this full-scale war. They cannot do that. They cannot control their expenses under control. The deficits are always exceeding the prognosticated threshold. This year, it will increase the planned number that was planned last October twofold. The expenses this year were 22%, not at 5%. And objectively, looking at this situation when everything is dependent upon the budget, there are no private investments in the economy, there are no Indian or Chinese investors coming to Russia. Budget is the only mom with a tit that can be milked for any expenses to continue making this economy grow. They don't have any other money. Therefore, I do not trust these numbers where they promise a very small growth of expenses and the deficit controlled, well at bay, near 1 trillion rubles. This again will jump out of the box, and next year I'm sure we'll see very different numbers. And the budget that Silvanov is drawing for his main viewer, Vladimir Putin, this is absolutely unrealistic. So overall conclusion, Putin is running out of money. This has basically already happened. And in order to balance the budget somehow for next year, Minister of Finance has to draw some very unrealistic pictures that cannot be supported by any recent experience or any graphs. And given that Putin's appetites, I absolutely do not believe that they'll be able to hold the additional growth of budget within 5% and the deficit under 1 trillion rubles. We've seen that in the first 3 years of war, nothing like that happened. And why would it happen next year? Even if they somehow magically figure a way to do it, it would imply a serious slowdown of all budgetary sector that will not get as much money from the budget as they all want to. And that's why perhaps this is one of the reasons why Minister of Economic Development is prognosticating a very serious slowdown in the refining industries and especially in the sectors that are related to military production. At least that's their official prognostication for next year. And we already see that this September, the index of business activity in processing industries, the so-called PMI index, is lower than 50%. That means that the production is dwindling, and it's the first time since spring of 22. So slowdown in the industry that is significantly dependent on the budgetary support is already happening. And if they will continue controlling their budget, that slowdown will only exacerbate. And if they will continue funding, their deficit will be exploding, and they're almost out of their additional financial reserves. They cannot really get more money from taxation, and they're running out of money sooner. So, as in that fairy tale, you turn left, you lose your horse, you turn right, you lose your head. So, Putin doesn't really have a good choice here. And I'll refer to a previous stream about crisis elements in Russian economy. Thank you for viewing it well. Take a look if you haven't. And basically, several days later, the project of federal budget that surfaced, that we're discussing here, is confirming the theories and explanations that we had there, that Putin has no more money to grow and to expand this war. And that's why the growth from military expenses next year is the most minimal compared to the previous years. And it's absolutely not matching the real needs of army and military-industrial complex. And if they figure a way to continue growing the expenses, that would imply crazy inflation again, as we're seeing there now. And second, very quick depletion of resources they have. So he really doesn't have good options in the current situations for his administration, where they maniacally are trying to continue this war against Ukraine. They do not have good choices. And this is what the project of a federal budget for 2025 is telling us. We'll continue tracking the situation, but that narrowing of the corridor of opportunities for Putin is rather obvious. Looking at these additional documents to the federal budget, you can draw a pretty clear picture. This is Vladimir Milov, and here we'll continue telling you truth about what is happening in Russia and in its position in the world. Truth without conspirology, without any fairy tale telling and sugarcoating. I doubt you'll find such a detailed analysis of Russian financial economic processes anywhere else but here. And they'll indicate that Putin is running out of resources. It's inevitable. However, he and some of his chorus sing in their predictions, and however much they wanted to portray differently. Don't forget to click like and subscribe. We'll continue bringing good, interesting news.